Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about the expenditure approach to measuring GDP, so gross domestic product. In the video I also include a discussion on how we treat the measurement of housing in GDP. I know that some students are interested in this point, so that's at the end of the video if you want it. It is a pretty long video, so the chapters are in the description if you want to skip to any particular part. I will say also that this is video number 3 in my series on GDP. In video number 1, I discussed the definition of GDP. In video number 2, I discuss why expenditure is equal to income, which is equal to output. In practice, there are 3 ways of measuring GDP. So we have the expenditure approach, the income approach, and the value added approach. I had planned to cover all 3 approaches just in one video, but it was way too long, so I'm just going to be doing expenditure in this one. And the expenditure method just involves adding up the total expenditure in a country during a given time frame. And we'll come to this point later, but we only count what we call final goods and services. Importantly for this approach is that we categorize our expenditure into different types. So you might be familiar with the following equation. Y here stands for total output. Sometimes we talk about it in terms of being total income or of total expenditure or sometimes total spending. So that's our GDP. And that's equal to C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government spending, plus X, which is exports, minus M, which is imports, and X minus M together make net exports. This is sometimes called the national income accounting identity. So let's go through each part, and I can start with C, consumption. This category is concerned with the expenditure of private individuals and households on final goods and services. It includes things like food, clothing, plumbing, haircuts, and legal services, etc. Now, we are only concerned with the consumption of final goods and services. I do talk about this issue quite a lot in the first video that I did in this series on GDP. But just as a brief recap, we differentiate between final goods and services and intermediate goods and services, where intermediate goods and services are used in the production of other goods and services, whilst final goods and services are not. So we only want to count the consumption of final goods and services. This is in order to avoid a problem of what we call double counting. You can have a look at video number 1 in this series for more information on that problem if you need it. The point that I wanted to talk about now, though, is that this really raises the question of, can the household sector ever consume an intermediate good or service? So why do we have to make the qualification that it has to be a final good or service? Well, it implies that households can consume intermediate goods and services, and this would make them kind of productive units, right? So in what sense can they produce anything? It's a really good question. I will address this issue at the end of the video because it's not for everyone. So I'll just put a star here to indicate that I will address this at the end. It is actually related to the next point here. Consumption does not include the purchase of new housing. New housing actually goes into the investment category of expenditure, even though it's expenditure that is done by households. Here, when I say housing, it could be a house, apartments, units, anything that provides accommodation. So I'm going to put another star here too, because the reason why we treat new housing as investment is related to the previous question of in what way households can ever consume intermediate goods. So more details on all of this at the end of the video if you want it. This leads us to the related discussion about how housing is treated in GDP more generally. Moving on though with consumption, it's also worth noting that we are only interested in the consumption of new goods and services. So the expenditure on a second-hand good is not included in GDP. The reason being is because nothing new has been produced, and GDP is all about tracking production. Now, I will say if you resell a second-hand good, for instance, through an auction house, whilst the price of the second-hand good sold would not be included in expenditure, the fees that go to the auction house would be included because that's a new service. Now, sometimes textbooks divide consumption into durables versus non-durables. Durable goods are things like cars, furniture, washing machines, etc. These goods tend to last a while, so their consumption lasts over a period of time. Non-durables are things like food, services. The consumption is immediate. So that's household consumption. Our next category of expenditure is I, investment. Investment expenditure involves expenditure on assets that add to and make possible future production. So, for instance, if a firm purchases machines or equipment or builds any new buildings that they're going to use in order to make more goods and services in the future, that goes into investment. Now, generally, investment spending is done by businesses, but as I said before, it also includes expenditure on newly built homes by households. Now, I will say here, different textbooks can differ in how they break investments up. So some make a big deal about residential investment, for instance, versus capital investment. So you should check your course here for anything special. Importantly though, the investment category includes spending on what we call inventories. So I said before that the expenditure approach adds up all of the expenditures of final goods and services in an economy, and that's in order to measure how productive an economy has been. But not all goods that are produced in an economy will be sold in the period of time that they are produced in. And so these goods in our accounts, we treat them as going into an inventory, which is a stock of goods that businesses hold to be sold later. In our accounting, we're going to treat that stock as being bought by the firm that produced them. This makes sure that there is an expenditure associated with the production of the good, and this preserves the identity between expenditure and production. I'll just take an example to illustrate this because it can seem a bit complicated. Let's imagine that a firm produces a book in 2021, but the book is sold in 2022. Now, the book is produced in 2021, so it should count towards 2021 GDP, not 2022 GDP. Now, the market value of the book, let's just say it's $9. And so in our accounting, we're going to say that the firm buys the book from itself and it becomes part of the firm's inventory. That's part of the investment category in 2021 GDP. When the book is sold in 2022, let's just say to a household, there will be a positive entry in the consumption category because a household has bought the book as a consumption good, but it will be taken out of inventory. So there will be a negative in the investment category in 2022. These two entries will cancel each other out. So we'll just end up with zero overall. And so I'll just repeat. In 2021, the value of the book is added to GDP via expenditure in inventories, which is in investment. In 2022, when the book is sold, we have entries in consumption and investment relating to the book, but it ends up to be zero overall. And that's absolutely correct because it shouldn't add to 2022 GDP because it was produced in 2021. So that's investment. The next category is government. This category includes government expenditure on final goods and services and gross investment. This sort of expenditure includes, for instance, light bulbs for street lights, the purchase of services such as street cleaning or health services, or the construction of new infrastructure. Importantly, this category does not include government transfers. So, for instance, government spending on, say, social security or pensions. Now, I will clarify here, government spending does include government investment spending though. So investment spending is things like on roads, public transport, that sort of thing. Now, even though that's an investment, that will go into our government category, not the investment category. Now, this point raises kind of a more general observation. When we look at how total expenditure is broken up, in general, the categories point to different types of actors in our economy. So consumption is all about households, investment is mostly about what businesses are doing, though granted, yes, we have the weird case of new housing, which I'll talk about at the end. Government is about government. So when we look to our statistics around this stuff, through the expenditure approach, we're actually getting a good idea of which parts of an economy are spending the most or not spending so much, etc. Now, our last category is net exports. So X is exports and M is imports. So X minus M is net exports. Exports includes expenditure on locally made goods and services by overseas residents. So a jar of honey, for instance, that's produced in Australia but bought by an American after it's exported to America, the value of that product goes to Australia's GDP, and that expenditure is measured as part of exports. Now, the consumption doesn't need to happen in a foreign country, right? So even overseas citizen, for instance, comes to Australia and consumes some locally made goods and services. So if we have tourists, for instance, that also counts as exports. Now, of course, just continuing on with the examples of Australia, there's lots of spending by Australian residents on goods that are made abroad, so imported goods. And this is throughout all of these other categories that we've spoken about. So we're going to take the value of those imported goods away, that's the negative M, from our total expenditure, because of course we don't want foreign-made product to count towards local GDP. That doesn't make sense. GDP is a measure of local production. So that is all of our expenditure categories when we add up expenditure in order to find GDP. Now, the expenditure approach is probably the most complicated out of the three ways of measuring GDP, just because there are so many categories here. In the next video, so in part 4, I'm going to go through the income approach. Right, now to my star section on housing and households as producers. So back in the beginning of the video when I was talking about consumption, I posed the question of whether households and private individuals could ever consume intermediate goods. And I also said that new housing went into the investment category, not consumption, even though households purchase the new housing, not businesses, and we typically associate consumption with households and investment with business. Well, actually, all of this is quite interesting, at least for me. I'll detour a bit now and talk about what we call the System of National Accounts, or just SNA. So the System of National Accounts is, and I quote here from the page, the internationally agreed standard set of recommendations on how to compile measures of economic activity. So I'll link to the page that I have up here in the description below. It looks like they're updating it soon. I'm in 2023 at the moment. You can also just find it if you search for System of National Accounts in your favorite browser. The SNA is like a rule book on how to record economic activity in an economy. And the idea is that we want everyone to be recording things in the same ways so that when we compare countries' GDP, we're comparing like to like. And if you go through the SNA, you'll realize very quickly that it's very big and there are lots of gray areas, so it's quite complicated. Now, one interesting thing that comes up is the idea that a household can be what we call an unincorporated enterprise. Now, an unincorporated enterprise is a producer unit, so they produce stuff, which is not incorporated as a legal entity separate from the owner, who could be a household, government, or a foreign resident. So in terms of households, unincorporated enterprises might be like really small farms, sole traders, that sort of thing. There's no company or firm legally, it's just the household. So we've answered our first question, can a household ever consume an intermediate good? Yes, if they are an unincorporated enterprise, they can produce stuff, and through that production, they will consume intermediate goods, goods that they will use in order to produce more stuff. Now, throughout the SNA, and especially I'll note sections 9.57 and 9.65, we see that owners of dwellings are considered unincorporated enterprises just in virtue of owning a home. So if you own a dwelling, you automatically become an unincorporated enterprise. We also see that housing is considered a service. So when you live in a dwelling, you're consuming the service of housing, and owners of housing are providing that service, hence their automatic allocation of the status of unincorporated enterprise. Since a housing is a service, it follows that new housing or any new dwellings belong in investment, since they're assets that allow for the production of a future service, i.e. housing services. Now, I think I know what some of you are thinking, because I had this thought. I can treat lots of things as providing a service, like my clothes provide a future service of warmth or protection, or my car provides a future service of transport, but I don't treat my car or my shirts as investments, and I don't become an unincorporated enterprise when I buy a shirt. So why are we singling out housing as being a service? And it's actually because of renters, because very often people rent. And this automatically treats housing as a service, and then we're kind of pushed to treating all housing as services in order to be consistent, or else we're going to get into a mess. So I'll talk about the sorts of messes that we might get ourselves into in a bit. We should note though that people typically don't rent clothes or cars kind of exclusively as their way of consuming these things. And if they do this, it's not a huge problem in terms of the consistency of our accounts, because it's a relatively rare event and it doesn't correspond to a huge amount of expenditure. Housing, on the other hand, often involves large expenditures. So in Sydney, where I live, rent is often between a third and a half of someone's income. So let's go through then how housing is treated in GDP. When an owner rents a property out to the tenant, the rental expenditure that the tenants pay to the owner goes into the consumption category in our calculations of GDP. So I think that's a pretty natural interpretation of where rent should go. But we are automatically treating housing as a service in this case. In order to extend this logic of a housing as a service, we're going to think about owners of dwellings that live themselves in the dwellings that they own. So they're called owner-occupiers. What we do is that the value of the rent that they would have paid for the service of housing that they are consuming is imputed in our accounts, and that imputed value goes into the consumption category of expenditure. Now here, imputed just means the inferred value, so an estimation, for lack of a better word, of the value of the housing service that the owner is consuming when they live in the dwelling, and we add that to the consumption expenditure. And just to be really clear, our owner-occupier doesn't actually pay any rent to themselves, but in our accounts, we account for the value of housing services that they are consuming by imputing a rent. So that's how we treat housing consumption in GDP. That's why housing is a service. That's why new houses are investments and not consumption, because we want to treat all housing consistently as a service, whether we're renting or not. Now, to see how important it is to be consistent in this, recall that one goal of the SNA was to deliver a set of accounting rules that make possible the comparison of different countries. Now let's take two countries, let's say Spain, who has a home ownership rate of about 76%, and we can compare Spain with Switzerland, who has a home ownership rate of 42%. So in Switzerland, a relatively large proportion of households rent and a relatively small proportion own, in comparison to Spain, where a smaller proportion rent and a larger proportion own. Now, if we didn't treat housing as we do, if we don't impute the rent of owner-occupiers, but if we kept on seeing rent as going into consumption, then places like Switzerland would have an inflated GDP in comparison to places like Spain, just on the basis of having proportionately more renters in their population. As another example of where this matters, imagine in Australia, for instance, where about 32% of households rent. Imagine if a large proportion of those renters just bought the house that they were already residing in. Well, rent goes into consumption, right? So if they did this, and if we didn't treat all housing as a service, they would drop off the expenditure map, so to speak, because they wouldn't be paying rent anymore, and GDP would massively decrease just overnight. Because a whole heap of rent that was going into consumption would no longer be going into that category because they would now be owners. So we get this kind of skewed result if we don't treat rental and owner-occupier housing as the same as services. Once we treat all housing as a service, so new houses are investment, and once we impute the rent of owner-occupiers, these problems go away, which is why we do it. Now, just as a final note, I should say that second-hand goods don't count in GDP, right? We've said that before. So the expenditure of already built housing doesn't go towards GDP. All right, that's it. As you can see from the SNA, there's just lots of stuff here. I haven't covered everything, and I'm definitely no expert on the SNA, but I hope that the video has helped you understand the expenditure approach to measuring GDP. There's lots of grey areas. Hopefully your teacher just stays away from those grey areas. I hope you guys are doing well. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys are having a lovely day or night.